The media told you there was a war going on. For 5 years, every highlight package got edited to emphasize the divide. Every matchup got marketed as a showdown. Every social media algorithm learned quickly that conflict between two young, extraordinarily talented women generated clicks, and clicks generated money, and money kept the machine running. So the machine kept running. Nobody stopped it. Nobody had a financial reason to. But here is the part that has been sitting underneath all of that noise, completely ignored, deliberately buried under layers of manufactured drama. Paige Bueckers and Caitlin Clark were never enemies. They were never rivals in the way the coverage sold it to you. And on January 27, 2026, Paige sat down on a podcast and said exactly that. Clearly, directly, without softening it for anyone's comfort, and dismantled years of carefully constructed storylines in under 10 minutes. What she revealed is not a heartwarming sidebar about two athletes being polite to each other. What she revealed is a structural indictment of how women's basketball gets covered, who profits from that coverage, and what the sport actually looks like when you strip away 5 years of narrative engineering and look at what was always underneath it. Because what Paige described, a friendship built on shared history, mutual respect forged through real competition, and chemistry that dates back to when they were both teenagers who hadn't yet become household names, is not a recent development. It was never a recent development. The friendship was always the truth. The rivalry was the product. If something about the constant conflict framing has never quite added up for you, trust that instinct. You were reading it correctly the whole time. And if you were the kind of person who wants the real story instead of the one the algorithm decided was most profitable, hit the like button right now. It takes 1 second and it pushes this video to every other person who is tired of being sold a narrative. Subscribe while you're at it and turn on notifications, because what we're about to break down goes deeper than anything you have seen covered on this topic, and you do not want to miss what comes after it. We are going to walk through exactly what Paige said, what it actually means for the sport, and why this moment matters far beyond a single podcast appearance. Stay with us. Let's start with the context nobody is giving you about why this Team USA camp moment landed differently than anything that came before it. Paige Bueckers showed up to that camp representing something specific. Her 2020 recruiting class, a group of players who came through the system together, trained together in the same gyms, competed in the same tournaments, and dreamed about the same destinations, had given themselves an identity. They called their crew the Young, not as a brand exercise, not as an ironic commentary, as a declaration, a statement of intent about where they stood in the hierarchy of the league and exactly what they planned to do about it. The name carried a message that anyone paying attention could hear clearly. We are new. We are hungry. We are not here to wait patiently at the back of the line. In a league that has historically treated veteran presence as the primary currency of legitimacy, where experience gets cited constantly as the reason younger players shouldn't be trusted with the big moments, this was a quiet act of defiance dressed up as a nickname. Young players get dismissed in professional sports in predictable ways. They don't have the reads, they haven't been through enough adversity, they haven't earned the right to be counted on when it matters. Paige's answer to that entire framework was to reject its premise entirely. Being young didn't mean being unprepared. It meant playing with something veterans sometimes can't manufacture because they've spent years learning to conserve it. An edge, a hunger, a refusal to accept the idea that the moment is too big for you before you've even stepped into it. The Young weren't a crew of players who happened to be the same age. They were a group of people who had decided, collectively, that youth was a weapon rather than a weakness, and they intended to use it. But what actually made this group different from any other collection of talented young players who arrive in a league with something to prove? What separated them was not the nickname. What separated them was the foundation underneath it. These weren't strangers assembled by a draft lottery who needed time to figure out how to coexist. Several of them carried history that stretched back years before the WNBA was anything more than an abstract future possibility in their minds. And that history is where everything you think you know about the Clark-Bueckers rivalry begins to fall apart. Here is the detail that should have been the headline 5 years ago and wasn't. Paige Bueckers and Caitlin Clark were teammates before either of them was famous enough for anyone outside their immediate circles to care about their names. As teenagers, they suited up together for USA Basketball's junior national programs, the U16 and U17 squads, and competed in international tournaments as members of the same American team, not as rivals, not as competitors from opposing schools trying to outperform each other on the recruiting circuit. As teammates. They ran the same sets, they learned each other's tendencies, they developed an understanding of how the other player sees the floor when the defense shifts, when the double team comes, when the open man appears in a place the offense didn't design for. They built real chemistry in those settings, the kind that can only exist when two elite players spend genuine time figuring each other out in a shared pursuit of a shared goal. By Paige's own account, those teams were something genuinely special, not because they had individual stars who were better than everyone else's individual stars, but because they actually played together. The collective was the point. The connection between players was the weapon. And two of the most important people in that collective were Paige Bueckers and Caitlin Clark, years before UConn and Iowa existed in the sports media conversation, years before the algorithm learned their faces and decided they needed to be enemies. Think carefully about what that means for everything that came after. When college started and the spotlight arrived and the television networks needed a storyline and the click economy needed fuel, the infrastructure for a rivalry got constructed around two players who already knew each other, who already respected each other, who already had years of shared experience from a time when none of the commercial incentives existed. The manufactured conflict was laid directly on top of a pre-existing friendship, and the friendship was simply never mentioned, not because it was hidden exactly, because it didn't serve the story anyone was trying to sell. The rivalry was not discovered, it was built, it was engineered, and it was built on a foundation that was already occupied by something entirely different. Paige acknowledged this directly on that podcast, and she did not soften the edges of what she was saying. She named the dynamic with a clarity that made it impossible to reframe as anything other than what it was. The media pins two players against each other. The fan bases absorb that framing and amplify it. The algorithm rewards the conflict because conflict drives engagement, and engagement drives revenue. And suddenly you have millions of people who have never interacted with either athlete, who have never watched either player practice, or travel, or sit through a rehab session, or work through a stretch of bad form, convincing themselves that there is genuine animosity between two people who are actually cool with each other, who are actually friends, who have been friends since before any of this existed. She said they both understand how the system operates. They accepted it because competition requires contrast and the spotlight requires tension, and neither player was naive enough to pretend otherwise. Understanding the game doesn't mean consenting to the fiction, though, and what Paige said next drew that line with complete precision. They were friends, not in the way athletes perform friendship at press conferences, with that carefully managed "we have mutual respect as competitors" language that says something without actually saying anything. Not in the detached, professionally diplomatic way that makes it sound like two people tolerate each other with grace. She said they were genuinely cool people who understood what the other was carrying, who recognized how parallel their pressures were, and who never, through all the fan-base wars and social media battles and manufactured tension, let any of that noise define how they actually felt about each other. Both of them had been franchise-level players since the moment they entered high school. Both of them had carried the weight of enormous expectations every single day for years, the kind of weight that almost no one in their peer groups could actually understand, because almost no one in their peer groups had ever experienced anything like it. That shared experience created a bond that millions of social media posts and years of rival team messaging simply could not touch. You cannot manufacture your way into that kind of connection, and you cannot manufacture your way out of it either. The narrative machine tried both. It failed at both.
And Paige, sitting on that podcast in January 2026, made sure everyone understood exactly why. There is another layer to what Paige's presence at that Team USA camp actually meant, and most of the coverage of this moment skipped past it entirely.
She did not show up to that gym as someone who had been cruising toward this moment on a smooth, uninterrupted trajectory. She showed up having fought through something that would have ended a lot of careers and genuinely altered a lot of others. The injuries she battled were not the kind that require a few weeks of rest and some physical therapy before a player returns to full form. They were the kind that force a complete physical and psychological rebuild from the ground up. Months of rehabilitation, months of watching the league continue moving forward without her in it, reading the updates, tracking the statistics, knowing the game was going on while she was in a gym somewhere doing the slow, unglamorous work of learning how to trust her body again. The doubt that fills the silence during a recovery like that is not subtle. Outside voices will fill in what you're going through with their own narratives, speculation about whether she'll ever be the same player, commentary from people who have never rehabbed a serious injury about what the injury means for her future value and her long-term ceiling. That is the environment she was working through. Showing up at that camp healthy, confident, locked in, and clearly moving without hesitation was not simply a basketball achievement. It was the conclusion of a personal story that had been building for years, one that had nothing to do with rivalries or algorithms or click economies. It was a human story about refusing to be defined by the worst stretch of your career and doing the work, all of it, every day, until the worst stretch is just something you came through rather than something that came through you. And she showed up to that camp to play alongside the most talked about player in women's basketball, not as a rival being forced into awkward proximity, not as a competitor tolerating a shared space, as someone completing a circle that began when they were both teenagers who had no idea what was coming for them, dreaming about exactly the kind of moment they were now standing inside. That context completely transforms what you see in the training camp footage. It stops being a nice storyline and starts being something with genuine weight behind it. This was always the destination. The manufactured rivalry was a long detour. The scrimmage footage from that Team USA camp was never supposed to be the story. It was preparation. It was work. But once those clips hit the internet, the conversation shifted immediately, because what people saw on that floor was not two players being cooperatively professional with each other. What they saw was two players who had always known each other, operating in real time, making decisions based on years of mutual awareness, and producing results that cannot be faked. Watch the play that pulled everyone's attention first. Caitlin pushes the ball in transition, reads the defense collapsing to protect the paint, and threads a bounce pass through a window that required not just the skill to deliver it precisely, but complete trust in where the receiver was going to be before she got there. Paige was already there. The catch was clean. The finish was automatic. That kind of execution does not happen between strangers who have been playing together for a week. That is the product of years of watching each other, studying each other, competing against each other at the highest levels of the sport, and building a read of how the other player moves, where she goes when the floor opens, and what she expects when the ball is coming. Later in the same session, the exchange reversed. Paige found Caitlin in transition with a pass that demanded perfect timing, early enough to allow a clean catch, precise enough to eliminate any realistic recovery opportunity for the defense. Caitlin scored. Neither play was an accident. Both plays were the result of something that had been developing for a very long time.
The people covering that scrimmage noticed what was actually happening. The spacing looked cleaner when these two shared the floor together. The pace of the offense increased. The decision-making accelerated because both players understand how to play alongside a teammate who commands defensive attention. Two elite playmakers and scorers on the floor simultaneously creates a problem for any defense that has no clean solution. Every time the defense committed to solving one of them, the other one exploited the adjustment immediately. The decision tree for the defense became unmanageable. And then Kelsey Plum entered the game. The moment all three of them were on the floor together, what had been a conversation about two exceptional players became a conversation about what this country might actually be assembling for Los Angeles in 2028. Plum provides an identical profile in a third direction: scoring off the dribble, shooting off the catch, playmaking when the defense collapses from yet another angle. Three players who can all create, all shoot, and all make the right pass to the open teammate. The commentators covering that scrimmage were not subtle about what they were looking at. They started talking about the Olympic roster immediately, using language that was specific and confident. The probability of this backcourt combination representing the United States in 2028 was described as very high. Nobody in that gym was treating it as a distant hypothetical. Now let's talk about what this partnership means commercially, because the basketball story and the financial story are completely inseparable here, and anyone covering only one of them is giving you half a picture. Caitlin Clark's arrival in the WNBA did not simply generate incremental interest in the league, it rewired the revenue infrastructure in ways that the ownership class was not fully prepared for and had to scramble to catch up with. Television viewership numbers the league had not approached in decades became the new baseline for Indiana Fever games. Merchandise sales established records that had never previously been set anywhere in the history of the league. Franchise valuations moved in ways that forced every owner and potential owner to fundamentally reconsider how they were approaching the business of women's basketball. The league looked different after her arrival in measurable, structural ways, not just culturally, financially. Paige Bueckers brings her own commercial infrastructure into this equation, and it is not a small one. She carried a Nike contract through her entire college career that reflected her standing as a generational talent before she had played a single professional game. She built a fan base at UConn that is deeply loyal and skews dramatically younger than almost any other audience in women's basketball, which matters enormously for long-term growth because younger audiences are the ones that compound over decades rather than years. Her presence in the league is not a compliment to Caitlin Clark's commercial footprint, it is a second engine running alongside it. And here is the critical piece that the rivalry framing actively prevented people from seeing. The overlap between the Clark audience and the Bueckers audience is not a zero-sum competition for the same pool of viewers. It compounds. Someone who came to women's basketball through Caitlin discovers Paige through their partnership at Team USA and becomes a fan of both players, of both franchises, of the league itself. The audience growth is additive in a way that creates structural momentum for everyone in the ecosystem, for both players, for their teams, for USA Basketball's broadcast partners, and for the WNBA's ongoing rights negotiations, which will be shaped significantly by the documented reach of its most visible stars. A Paige and Caitlin backcourt at the 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles is not simply a basketball asset, it is a media event. It is the kind of pairing that turns casual viewers into appointment television viewers, the kind that pulls people who have never watched a full WNBA game into a sports bar at 8 p.m. on a Thursday because they need to see what happens next. The 2028 games on American soil will be the most watched women's basketball event in this country's history under any reasonable projection. Put these two players at the center of it, on their home soil, after years of WNBA growth have primed a domestic audience to care deeply about the outcome, and the commercial ceiling becomes genuinely difficult to calculate in advance. Nobody has a model for this, because nothing quite like this has existed before. Caitlin's own comments about Paige added a dimension that most of the coverage moved past too quickly, and it deserves more careful attention than it received. She did not offer generic praise. She was not doing the obligatory media tour compliment routine, where athletes say nice things about each other and nobody believes any of it because the language is always the same. She was specific in a way that signals genuine observation accumulated over a long period of time. She talked about Paige's poise, not just that she has it, but what it looks like in practice, the way she operates without forcing, the way she takes what the defense offers instead of demanding what it's not willing to give. She noted that Paige plays older than her age suggests she should, that her decision-making carries a calm that most players her age haven't developed yet and won't develop for years. She can score from 3 levels. She creates for teammates as readily as she creates for herself. Nothing in the environment rattles her. These are not compliments assembled for a soundbite. These are the observations of someone who has spent years studying the player across from her, watching how she moves under pressure, cataloging how her game operates in specific situations, paying serious attention in the way that only elite competitors actually do. That level of specific recognition only comes from sustained attention over a long period of time. You cannot fake the precision of it.
Both players made the same underlying point through entirely different framings. The respect between them was never new. It was never something that developed recently in the warming glow of shared national team ambition. It was always there. Underneath the rivalry packaging, underneath the fan base intensity, underneath the media framing that simply had no commercial room for nuance. Real competition generates real respect when the competition is genuine. And the competition between these two was as genuine as it gets in women's basketball at any level. That is exactly why what is forming between them now carries actual substance rather than just narrative convenience. Here is the angle that has not been fully articulated anywhere in the coverage of this story, and it is the angle that makes everything else make sense. The 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles are not just another major sporting event on the calendar. They are a generational statement. A once-in-a-generation alignment of circumstances, the right players at the right age with the right commercial footprint on the right soil in front of the right audience, that the sport of women's basketball has never had access to before and may not have access to again for a very long time. The United States has a window to put together a women's basketball program that captures the full athletic and commercial potential of this particular moment in the sport's history. A young core anchored by the 2 most marketable players the game has ever produced, competing on American soil in front of a domestic audience that has been primed by years of WNBA growth to care deeply and personally about the outcome. Paige Bueckers said something during that podcast that deserves to be heard with that context clearly in mind. She talked about the original dream that the young crew carried with them, coming to the pros, representing the country at the Olympic level. That was always the destination. The WNBA was the path. The rivalry was the noise along the road. The social media ecosystem is processing this shift in real time, and what's happening is genuinely interesting to watch. On X and across Reddit, fans who spent years firmly planted on opposite sides of the Clark-Bueckers divide are watching the same training camp footage and arriving at the same conclusion independently without anyone telling them to get there. These two are better together. The intensity of the rivalry was never really about conflict between the players. It was about how extraordinary both of them are, and how genuinely exciting it was to watch that level of talent collide. Now that the energy is pointed in the same direction instead of against itself, it isn't diminishing, it is building into something larger than either individual story ever was. Paige Bueckers did not just speak honestly about Caitlin Clark on a podcast. She handed us a new frame for the next decade of women's basketball, one where the rivalry that sold millions of clicks and generated years of fan base heat becomes the backstory for a partnership that could define American basketball on the world stage. The manufactured conflict is closing. What replaces it is not a simple friendship story wrapped in a feel-good bow and packaged for easy consumption. What replaces it is a foundation.
Two players who were told by every platform, every algorithm, and every media incentive structure that they were supposed to be enemies are building something that has actually been forming since they were teenagers, since before the cameras arrived, since before anyone had a financial reason to care what their relationship looked like. The scrimmages you saw from that camp are the first chapter of what that actually looks like in practice. The chemistry was not performed for the footage. It was visible in the footage because it already existed before the footage started rolling. Two elite players who understand each other deeply, who have studied each other for years, who share a history that predates everything the media built on top of it, are finally playing on the same side. And the sport they represent is about to be better for it in ways that extend far beyond a single Olympic cycle. The real question is not whether the chemistry between them is genuine. You saw the footage, you heard the podcast. The answer has been obvious for a long time to anyone willing to look past what the algorithm was serving them. The real question is how quickly the larger conversation finally catches up to what Paige said out loud, that this was always going to happen, that it was always natural, and that the rivalry was never the truth about who these two players are or what they're capable of becoming when they are finally, after all of it, playing together. The road to 2028 has started. The team is taking shape, and the two players at the center of it have been building toward this moment since they were teenagers who had no idea the entire world would eventually be watching.